Good evening. I'm Julie Mashak, Director of Global Programs in the 92nd Street Y's Belfer Center for Innovation and Social Impact. Thank you so much for joining us. Tonight's conversation is part of a new initiative from the 92nd Street Y called the Campaign for 100%. Between now and Election Day, we will bring you a series of conversations on the impact of voting on individual lives, communities, government, and society as a whole. Please go to 92y.org/campaign for 100% to learn more. And now it is my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's conversation on who votes, who doesn't, and why it matters. A very special thank you to the Knight Foundation for their support and collaboration on tonight's event. In 2020, the Knight Foundation published the 100 Million Project, a landmark comprehensive look at America's non-voters. The study surveyed the political views, attitudes, and behaviors of 12,000 chronic non-voters, both nationally and in 10 swing states. The project's findings raise important questions about who participates in democracy, who doesn't, and what would change if the 100 million non-voters showed up on Election Day. Please go to the100million.org to learn more. And now, please join me in welcoming this evening's panel. Andrea Hailey is CEO of Vote.org, the largest nonprofit, nonpartisan voting registration and get out the vote technology platform in America. Amy Walter is the host of WNYC's Politics with Amy Walter on the Takeaway. She's also the national editor of the Cook Political Report, where she provides analysis of the issues, trends, and events that shape the political environment. Gerald Seib is the executive Washington editor of the Wall Street Journal, where he writes the weekly Capital Journal column. Sam Gill is Senior Vice President and Chief Program Officer at the Knight Foundation. And our moderator this evening is Jami Floyd, Senior Editor, Race and Justice Unit at WNYC.
Thanks so much, Julie. And before we get started, we'd love to share with you a short video that elucidates the work of the 100 Million Project.
There's a crisis facing our democracy. Who has the power to solve it? Is it America's voters? Or perhaps it's America's non-voters? In 2016, we witnessed one of our country's most contentious presidential elections. Donald Trump won the presidency, and Hillary Clinton won the popular vote. But who did most Americans support? Nobody.
I am not registered to vote.
I haven't voted.
I didn't vote in the past election cycle.
I do not vote.
I don't think I'm going to vote.
Nearly 100 million eligible voters did not vote. This is the story of perhaps the most important voice in America yet to be heard. The 100 Million Project is a landmark study of 12,000 non-voters, done at unprecedented scale and depth. So who are these 100 million Americans? They are as diverse as this country, as different as 100 million people can be. Many non-voters lack basic faith in our democratic system. 38% of non-voters say they are not confident that elections represent the will of the people. Many believe the system is rigged.
Me and my sister always think there's a conspiracy theory that it's like rigged.
I think the whole thing is predetermined.
I think it's rigged.
Non-voters engage less with news and feel underinformed on politics. And yet many non-voters are college graduates, and over a third are middle class or wealthier. Democrats, Republicans, and independents each make up a third of non-voters. Half of respondents reported an unfavorable view of President Trump, 40% favorable and the rest undecided. The emerging electorate, 18 to 24-year-olds, are less informed, less interested in politics, less likely to vote in 2020 than non-voters overall. Are we losing a generation of voters?
I'm not informed on anything, so I feel like my vote's going to be wasted.
I feel like being young and voting, people will judge you for it because you're not educated enough about the whole voting process.
Increasing voter turnout isn't just about politics, it's about the future of our democracy. To start the most important conversation of 2020, visit the100million.org.
So we encourage you to visit the100million.org. And right now, I'd like to introduce our panelists. We're so pleased tonight to be joined by Sam Gill from Knight Foundation, who will be happy to field any of your questions directly about this research. Also with us tonight, Andrea Hailey. She'll be joining us to talk more about those 100 million people who aren't voting. And we've got two journalists to join us tonight as well. Gerald Seib is with us. Amy Walter, my colleague at The Takeaway and Beyond. Let me give you some broader sense of who these participants are with us this evening by going around and asking a question of each of you as we begin. So Amy Walter, let me begin first with you. The Cook Report is well known, I think, to many in our audience. Of course, you're also the Friday host of Politics with Amy Walter at The Takeaway. What do you make of the fact that 100 million people aren't voting? This report, of course, dropped before COVID-19 was a factor in the United States. It was fast moving as a pandemic, but it had yet to hit our shores. We weren't shut in. We were yet to be afraid. We did not have a U.S. Postal Service in crisis. We didn't have fear-mongering about absentee balloting, at least not widespread. And yet even then, people weren't voting. Right. Are you shocked, stunned, stoic, cynical?
Well, this is right. That's it. That's gets to the heart of it, isn't it, Jamie? And I think it's a discussion we've been having for quite some time. Certainly the 2016 election put this conversation in a different place than it had been previously. But the focus and the conversation around lack of faith in institutions writ large. And, you know, if you think about where we've been in the 21st century, it's questioning so many of those institutions that for so many years seemed like they were never going to, maybe it's not fair to say that they're never going to fail us, but that certainly the idea that on almost every front, Americans have felt more disengaged, disenchanted with everything from organized religion and the scandals that have come out from the Catholic Church, for example. Obviously, you had the financial crisis and the lack of faith in that it spurred in Wall Street and the sort of those financial institutions. Major League Sports, whether it's doping or cheating in some other sort of way. I'm still a big fan of the Tour de France, even though every year there's always a scandal about who's doping and somebody gets caught every single time. And then, of course, when it comes to the idea of politics, it has looked broken for quite some time. So all of those things together certainly breed a level of cynicism that doesn't surprise me, especially among younger voters who don't know of any other existence. This has been all they've known and all that they've seen. One thing I think, and we'll get to, I'm sure, more discussion about this, but a frustration I've had for quite some time, and I've talked about this with folks who do campaigns for a living, the consultants and strategists who work on campaigns, is that they are as responsible for the cynicism as anybody else, whether they're Democrats or Republicans. This did not start with Donald Trump. They've been running campaigns focused, as they're supposed to, in terms of getting a paycheck, on the short term. They got to get their candidate across the finish line. That's what matters to them. The problem with the short-term thinking, of course, is that in doing so, what many of them are doing is destroying the very institution of Congress itself. So most of the ads, if you've seen them, start like this: Washington's a disaster. Washington's a cesspool. Washington's terrible. Politicians are terrible, right? And now, lo and behold, all these years later, people go, well, you know what? I think Washington's pretty terrible. It's as if the political class has been, it's sort of the equivalent of think of them as trying to sell Coke or Pepsi, right? And they've spent the last 20 years telling you how terrible soda is for you, But then at the end of the commercial where they say it's bad for you, it's going to make you fat, the caffeine's not good for you, sugar, you have too much sugar in your system. But anyway, drink more Coke, right? You got to have it. That's what's been sold to voters for many, many years. And so, of course, why participate in a process that at the end of the day is going to disappoint you?
So, Jerry, I imagine you would guess I'd come to you next. You have spent so many years as an executive editor, so clearly nothing shocks you, I would imagine. But you also just wrote about this, right, for the Wall Street Journal.
Yeah.
And I wonder what your take is. Are you less surprised, more surprised, a spin-off of what Amy just said? And also give us a little bit of your insider knowledge based on your own reporting before we go to the guy who knows the nitty-gritty over at night.
Well, we're in the year 2020, so nothing surprises or shocks anymore, right? You have to start there. But I will say, I look at these numbers and, Amy and I have been writing about this stuff for years and I know it, but every time I see it, I'm still shocked. And more than that, I think most people are shocked. I think if you ask people to guess what percentage of eligible voters actually vote, they'd say 80 or 90%. I think people who don't spend a lot of time on this are even more shocked than we are at this number. I think, and Amy touched on this, I think what's really troubling about this number, though, is less the size of it, but the why that you find in the Knight report. And if you had explored this topic in say the 1990s, when I first started writing about this, I think the answer you would have gotten from a lot of people who didn't vote is they would have said, well, there's not a dime's worth of difference between the two parties, Democrat, Republican, what difference does it make? Well, that is not what people say now. What people say now, as Amy suggested, they say the system's broke, it's rigged, nobody listens to what I say anyway, nothing ever happens. Those are cynical, corrosive reasons not to vote. And I would argue that's a much worse reason, regardless of the numbers, the reason people aren't voting, particularly young people not voting, is much more dangerous for society and democracy than we would have found 20 years ago. So I think in addition to the numbers, that's compelling. I would just add one last thing. Somebody who's discovered this and is trying to do something about it is the Trump campaign. Amy's colleague David Wasserman from the Cook Report looked into who didn't vote state by state recently, and he found that in the key states of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, a majority of the people who didn't vote in 2016, 60% and above, were white voters with less than a college education, i.e. core Trump voters. And this is a reason the Trump campaign is knocking on doors, going in the midst of the pandemic, door to door in those states. They're trying to register these people to vote. Whether that works or not, I don't know. But there is a campaign right now that's figured this out.
When you say knocking on doors, do you mean literally knocking on doors?
I mean, literally, they have thousands of people, and in Ohio too, by the way, out knocking on doors there. And the Biden campaign is not doing this. But the Trump campaign's proposition is there are hidden Trump voters out there in the population we're talking about, and we're going to go find them, notwithstanding the pandemic. And we're just hoping people are willing to answer the door and talk to us. And I think they're finding they are.
Wearing their masks, I'm sure.
I wouldn't bet on that, but...
Let me come over to you, Andrea, because Hailey, CEO of Vote.org, and ask you if, now I'm going from the journalists to the, let's say, practitioners, and ask you if what you have found on the ground in this election cycle, let's just stick with this one, comports with what you're hearing, reasons for not voting, and who's not voting.
Well, one of the things that we're seeing this election cycle is a direct correlation between major social moments and tragedies in our collective history and registration of a younger generation of voters. And so one of the things we saw at Vote.org directly after the murder of George Floyd, in the week of the initial protests, we saw 293,000 young people register to vote through our site. So we are seeing, and then with the passing of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, We also saw another spike in registrations that we saw 118% spike in registrations that skewed younger and female. And so I think that it's a yes and, because we're in really unique moments and circumstances in our nation's history right now. And what we're seeing happen in real time is a younger generation that is showing up to register, and we'll see if they show up to vote after that. But I want to note that, you know, when we're talking about the non-voters that we're talking about in the report are a little different than the young voters, because young voters haven't had a time to fully establish their voting history yet. And so, you know, the other thing that we're seeing is 4 million 18-year-olds, you know, people turn 18 this year. And then we have to figure out how are we going to on-ramp a new generation of voters into the civic process and create healthy voting habits to ensure a thriving democracy in the future. But right now, what we are seeing is an increased interest and increased actions from a younger generation.
Up-driving democracy, is that what you just said?
On-ramping.
On-ramping, but then you said something about up-driving democracy. What was that phrase? About democracy?
Creating a healthy and thriving democracy.
Thriving. Oh, thriving democracy. Two words that I've not heard together in so long, I didn't recognize them in tandem. I want to ask you about 2016, obviously a completely different election cycle. This one is like no other. We thought that was like no other. But is it kind of a one-off because of the Sanders effect? Can we not really use the 2016 cycle to think about young people and voting because of the impact of the Bernie Sanders campaign on the youth turnout?
Well, I don't know. Maybe we should look at the, you know, the midterm election, which we saw an uptick in young voters and participation. If somebody is turning out in a midterm, they are more likely to turn out in the general election. And we know that once somebody, you know, participates in 2 or more elections, they're more likely to have a voting habit. And so, you know, I think that what we are seeing maybe consistently here since the midterms is an uptick in youth voting and interest. What we did see in 2016 was lower youth turnout and outsized third-party voting among young people. So, you know, those are 2 of the factors that played into that. But I think that the trend line is that youth voting and participation is ramping up.
I see both Jerry and Amy nodding vigorously, but make notes because I got to go over to Sam. And Sam, you're Sam Gill, Knight Foundation. You're the guy with the goods in this conversation. And we've got questions from the audience actually for you. But first, where do you want to go here with this conversation? It's your sandbox to play in. Do you want to, what do you want to talk about? Youth vote? Do you want to talk about the demise of democracy? I mean, where do you want to go, man?
I don't want to talk about the demise of democracy, but I'm happy to talk about it. I think the big question, I think what motivated us to undertake this study is a lot of our discussion about who votes and doesn't vote has to do with who's going to win an election. And the question of who votes and doesn't vote should really be about your question. You know, what is democracy headed for demise, or are there the conditions of its reinvigoration? In trying to understand the people who have decided that this really significant democratic process, this ritual, is not for them. So happy to take any questions that will inform that discussion.
Let me pick that apart a little bit. So when I mean, not to get too caught up in the founders, who are actually rather unpopular at the moment, but when they conceived of this democratic experiment, did they ever envision 100% participation, or was it always going to be a process in which, you know, 50% of the people participated, and that 50% would be a well-educated elite who would go to the polls? First of all, we know they didn't expect women to participate because women didn't have a vote. My ancestors, at least half of them, weren't considered full people, so we weren't voting. Native people weren't voting. There were a whole bunch of people who weren't voting, so let's just put them aside. But even among white men, you had to have property, and there was an assumption maybe that you were going to have a certain level of education. So maybe the democratic, the philosophy of our democracy perhaps was flawed from the start, expecting that only a certain portion, 50% or fewer or less, grammar, would turn up.
Well, I think there's clearly tomes have been and could be written about this question, but I would point to an important distinction that I think our survey got to that Jerry keyed in on, which is absolutely, you can't argue that the founders had a clear circumscribed idea of who was supposed to vote and to make the decision about who should rule. But there's a through line in our democracy that remains true, which is that when it works because the many want to delegate to relatively few the responsibility to lead. And one thing that I think the founders certainly believed, and I would argue is a pretty fair mainstream interpretation, say, of the Federalist Papers, is that this system works if people believe in it. That this system works because people have confidence that it is producing the will of the people, that it's accountable to the will of the people. And I think something that should concern us about all those people who aren't voting is that despite the incredible gains that we have made in extending the franchise to so many who were explicitly or implicitly excluded at the founding, we are losing the big argument that this is a process that you can and should believe in, not only as an act, but as an act that will make the country work for you as the people. And as Jerry noted, there are a lot of different reasons that people give for not voting. But what is really disturbing about this study is that if you start to group them, the most prevalent reason is a lack of faith in the system, one. And secondly, non-voters are actually more likely to have specific skepticism about the mechanisms of the election. So non-voters were less likely to believe that votes would be accurately counted. This was before COVID. This was before you had an incumbent president actively raising questions about whether the election could be believed. This was before we were worried about social media a year ago, but maybe not as worried as we are today. So that was before that had really reached a fever pitch. And you have non-voters much less likely to believe, say, the Electoral College is an effective system, less likely to believe that in general elections represent the will of the people, less likely to think that Washington matters to them, to their lives.
Less likely, Sam, than when?
Well, less likely than voters is what is the important contrast that we found. So non-voters are far less likely than voters to have this fundamental faith in just the basic mechanics of the voting system.
All right, I heard you invoke Jerry's name more than once. So Jerry, I'm coming over to you. He's saying less likely than voters, but I'm going to ask you, less likely than ever before?
Well, the numbers would say not necessarily, because this has been an ongoing problem. I think, though, that there's something about the moment that we're in now that makes it more troublesome, because what you have basically a couple of forces colliding in 2020, right? You have, in the poll that we do, the Wall Street Journal NBC News poll, we are seeing higher interest in this election than we ever have before. We're seeing the level of election now in September that matches the level of interest in 2008, just before Barack Obama was elected, when his presence on the ballot drove up interest in the election. So we're at historically high levels of interest in this campaign season, at least it would seem so. So you maybe will have 150 million people who will vote this year. That would be more than ever before. That still leaves millions, I guess, 80 million people off on the sidelines. So that's force number one. But force number two, we now have an incumbent president who is telling people what Sam's study suggests they already believe, which is the system's rigged, it's fixed, your vote won't count anyway. What's that going to do to this enthusiasm over the next 6 or 7 weeks? That's A. And B, and as you've already mentioned, the COVID crisis. Will people actually find that their vote is so important to them that they will go around the obstacles and do it anyway? So I don't know where we're going to end up in 2020. I do think there is a kind of an interest in the electorate that could be set on fire this year, particularly among young voters, but I'm not convinced that's actually what's going to happen in the end.
Right, Amy. On the one hand, a fire is burning, and people are alight with passion over issues like restorative justice and defunding the police. But on the other hand, the obstacles Jerry's referring to, the obstacles are extreme. You risk your life to go to the polls. And if you try to vote in an absentee fashion, it's convoluted and challenging, no matter which state you're in. It seems to be difficult, to say the least.
The other issue too is what's driving this intensity. You know, again, if we were plopped down into this moment in time from outer space, right? We hadn't lived through these last 8 months. We would say, well, of course, the reason for the intensity is that all these crazy things happened to these people on this planet. Once in a lifetime pandemic, social, racial justice issues, of course, an economy that is collapsing. And then when it does, as it is recovering, it is only exacerbating all the inequities that were already inherent in this economy. But really and truly, we know what's driving interest in this election, and it's Donald Trump. And it's what drove interest in the 2018 election as well. And so the question going forward is, you know, if elections then become really about enthusiasm either for, like we saw in 2008, for Barack Obama, or in 2020, which is against Donald Trump, is that a healthy democracy? Versus people are invested in turning out because they believe that their vote matters, because they're putting people in office who are going to solve these whether it's a once in a lifetime problem or persistent problems of our society. And I don't think we're going to get that's not what this election is. We're not going to have the answer at the end of this election, but I do think, you know, the person of Donald Trump is what's responsible for this enthusiasm more than anything else.
And Andrea, do you think, I hear what Amy's saying, an election that's more about personality than it is about policy or issues, as we might say if we were outside the Beltway. Are elections ever really about policy? Aren't they always about personality for the voter?
I think we're you know, we've seen in the past few years a progression towards an idea of, and part of it is just the changing media landscape as well. You know, I took a class once called Entertainer in Chief. It kind of reminds me of that. Like we've seen a progression towards personalities, towards media presence, all of that. At the same time, what's unique about this moment in time, I think, is that we're also seeing people ask more questions about local level government. So what does my mayor do? What does my police chief do? What does you know, the city council do? Who's responsible for budgets? All of this kind of stuff is happening in real time right now. So I think people are also looking for, how does all of this affect my daily lived experience? And I agree with Amy when it, you know, comes to the question of how people have been turned. It's kind of astonishing how people have been turned against Washington, their very capital city, right? Where policies are being created that affect everybody's lives. But it's much more difficult to tell somebody that everybody in their local government, people they may know or see, or, you know, neighborhood councils and things like that, school boards are, you know, against them. And so I think that there's been a lot more interest this year in kind of understanding, especially, and, you know, at vote.org, we specifically work with a younger demographic. So I think there's been a lot more interest in understanding kind of the chart of who is responsible for what at the local level. And so that's a little bit less driven by some of the, you know, climate. And I do think that, you know, it's interesting on the whole. We've seen, I think Harvard just released a study that said that among the younger generation, that 63% said that they were going to participate in this upcoming election, that they definitely wanted to vote. And that's up from 47% in 2016. So I do think people are starting to look at, you know, what is my civic responsibility? How can I create the world I want to see? Those sorts of questions, and really evaluating them out in a way that I don't know that I've seen previous to this year.
Let me follow it up, Andrea, with a question from Tony, who writes in to say, given how divisive this election is, do you think that the results, meaning the outcome in the end, will then lead to more voters or non-voters? In other words, after it's all over, are people going to check out if the candidate they didn't vote for wins? Kind of an interesting take on what we're talking about. We're all focused on November 3rd and the immediate aftermath, but Tony's asking about, I guess, the midterms thereafter and the next presidential election cycle. And I guess you could even say down ballots in state and locals.
You know, in a normal cycle, we would see interest drop off. We would see people get kind of quiet. One of the unusual things this year that we saw at vote.org is really our numbers of registrations on the site and people looking for voting information on our site started to pop up in January. That's very early. That, you know, it's unprecedented on the site to see that kind of growth so early in the cycle. And so I kind of think all bets are off in a lot of ways for what post-election looks like. I would guess that people are going to stay engaged. We seem to have a high level of activity, a high level of interest. I don't necessarily see, I think the, you know, polarization is deep. I don't know if that interest will just fade away like it normally would, and then it would ramp up again, you know, before the midterm. So it's an excellent question. I don't know that I have, you know, I'm super interested to hear everybody else's take on that.
Let me have one other person weigh in, and then I have a bunch of other questions I want to get to. Jerry, you want to weigh in on that one?
Sure. I think the answer is it depends in part on how the election goes. And this is why I think it's really important that the people who run the election apparatus in this country, and I'm talking not about at the federal level, but at the state level, secretaries of state and local election boards, run this election with all the mail-in ballots in such a way as to inspire confidence in people that it's been done right. And leave aside what Donald Trump says, convince people that this process works and they can have faith in it. That is the critical factor, I would say, this year. I would just add one other thing very quickly that occurred to me as we were talking earlier. There's one force this year that I think is very positive in this regard. You know, in the post-George Floyd environment, there have been many reminders of how important the right to vote was and the price that was paid in years gone by, particularly in the 60s, when this vote was not as taken for granted as it is now. And people of a certain age like me remember that. People who are younger than me don't necessarily remember that. They've been reminded this year of how important the right to vote really was to people for decades and decades now, and it shouldn't be taken for granted.
Well said. Let me come over to you, Sam, with a question, a different question from our audience. And it goes back to something you mentioned in your initial comments, I think, about reasons that people feel they can't trust the system. And it's that one we hear so much about, the Electoral College. Mark wants to know, would more people vote if it was just a popular vote and there were no Electoral College? Does anything in I mean, I guess you can't really answer that just looking at this research, but what's your instinct given everything that you've learned wading through it in recent weeks and months?
Yeah, I think, you know, when we asked non-voters about the Electoral College, our hypothesis was actually that they wouldn't really have an opinion on it, that it would feel like arcana that's more relevant to people who are really interested in who's going to win and why they're going to win. And obviously, if you're in the political junkie class, this is really important to you in trying to figure out whether your candidate, the candidate that you're pulling for, is going to win or not. But what, you know, we did find is that non-voters did have an opinion. They weren't positive on the system, but I think, again, it's sort of exhibit X, you know, of why this system is rigged or why this system makes no sense. I don't think it's an overriding issue. I don't think that if tomorrow we did away with the Electoral College, you'd see an upswell in non-voters saying, now I'm going to get off the sidelines and start to vote. But I doubt that it's having a salutary effect. And I think something that we've been hearing consistently from, you know, everyone in this conversation has pointed out is every single one of these features of our election system can either be an object of discourse to deride that election system or to emphasize its significance and its rationality in delivering an effective democratic system. And the performance that it's used for, most commonly, especially now, is to explain why the system doesn't work. And so to the extent that those are things that non-voters already believe, you're not giving them reasons to vote. And that's also why I think, this year is an opportunity. This is a year where if you didn't think the decisions that are made in Washington matter in your life, you found out that they do. And so every time that we talk about to tell non-voters that everything they thought last year is still true about our system, as opposed to here's the reason, as Jerry says, that you can count on the result of the election. It doesn't even have to be here's why your vote matters. Here's why you can count on the result of the election. Here's why your vote is going to make a difference in who wins and who loses. That's an opportunity, it seems to me, to actually bring one of those people into the fold of voting in this democracy.
I asked the others about the impact of COVID, but I didn't ask you, Sam, about the impact of COVID on the vote. This came down, your research came down before the pandemic hit our shores. And maybe it's a little unfair to ask you this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. What do you think the impact will be on people like those surveyed in your study?
It's a great question. I think those who don't think that their vote will matter, I think that segment, there's certainly a chance that segment may come off the sidelines and say, I lost my job, someone who I know got sick or even died, and so now I think that my vote matters. I suspect that those who just feel the system can't deliver for them have probably had that view confirmed. And so I would certainly fear in a presidential election that they're less likely to be persuaded. But there are some other signs actually that this may have a salutary effect on voting. Non-voters are less likely to actively consume news and information, and that cuts both ways. I think those who are more likely to consume news and information about politics are the kind of political junkie culture that's arguably driving some of the polarization, contributing to it. Eitan Hirsch, a political scientist who helped with the study, believes that actually sort of a problem in our politics is that this is a game for so many, including those who are voting and following it. But more people are following the news. And so if you're more plugged in as a result of COVID, we know that more people are following the news, you may be more likely to vote. There's some other positive signs, though, that we're seeing. So one in our backyard, and this goes to Andrea's point about local elections. I'm in Miami. That's where Knight Foundation is headquartered. And in a primary vote for a county mayoral election, we had record turnout. And I think that's people recognizing, to Andrea's point, that the people I know and live with and can hold accountable are making decisions about whether my business can be open or closed, whether my school is open or closed, whether I'm being exposed to a risk or not. And so I think that's a really positive sign. We also did a follow-on survey with college students who tend to be more active and key into some of the issues that have already been discussed. But college students at a very high rate report that they're likely to vote. The number one issue that they're talking about is COVID. So it's a proximate issue that's bringing them off the sidelines. But one other thing I will point out, and it relates to something Andrea mentioned, when we asked these college students, what's the best way to be politically active, it's to vote in local elections. It's not to vote in national elections. It's the number one thing that they say. So I think one question that we really should ask ourselves at the end of this election is not only who voted for president, but who turned out for what? And are there other bright spots in our democracy that we may or may not have expected as a result of COVID that we can actually use to build engagement in other parts of our democracy?
Well, that jumps me over to Amy, because we spend a lot of our time, Amy, talking about the presidential race, the vice presidential candidates. You spend a fair amount of time, to your credit, talking about senators, congresspeople, governors, people who matter, I think, in this country, make a big difference in policy, the policy debate. But I talk a lot about the Supreme Court as if there aren't any other judges anywhere in the United States on the federal bench or state courts, or magistrates or anyone else. But it's a really good point that state houses have a lot of power. And obviously, even city councils have a lot of power, mayoralties. And maybe people will start to recognize that after COVID. We talk about those things too, of course.
Yeah.
But people may really start to wake up to the realities that their local municipalities and the people in their state legislatures have a big impact on their lives.
I do think that's really important. And I do want to see, and I talk about this all the time with younger people, those both as voters, people who want to be engaged as voters, but also who want to be involved as practitioners. People will say to me, oh, I want to get involved in politics. And I always say, do not come to Washington. Stay where you are, work in your community. That's the best education you're ever going to get. And it's the most direct representation that we have. I covered the House for 20 years. It was my favorite beat. I think most people who cover Capitol Hill say the House is their favorite beat because these folks are the most accessible. You can literally just go up and pull one of them aside and talk with them. The Senate is much more cloistered. And of course, the president, so that's a whole different story. So the closer you are to those levels of government, the more engaged you can personally be. Even you don't have to be a reporter to engage. I'm going to just put one little stink bomb into this, however, I'm sorry to say, which is in this, that unfortunately our polarization that we see at the federal level is drifting into state and local politics too. And, more and more people, and I think we're going to see in this election, especially, again, one that's driven so much by your feelings about this person who's sitting in the White House, is that what I think people are doing then is painting a broad brush. Anybody who has an R after their name or a D after their name, I cannot possibly support because they are the party of Donald Trump. They are the party of the radical left, whatever you want to, whatever the stereotype is of that party at that moment. And it used to be that state legislatures, they were the laboratories of democracy, right? Because they were the kinds of places where all of the infighting and the partisanship of Washington, hadn't really made their way to those places. And now, unfortunately, they look a lot like state capitals look a lot more like Washington than the other way around. And so what we're finding is that same level of dysfunction and distrust. And I mean, if you just peek in on Wisconsin, for example, the dysfunction between the governor, who's a Democrat, and the Republican-controlled legislature is dramatic, and it had an immediate impact on voting. The fact that they could not, going into that April primary, right at the beginning of the pandemic, they could not agree on basic rules of the road for having a vote at that time, meant that a whole bunch of people stood in line, crowded together at a time of pandemic. A lot of people turned in ballots that they didn't quite know how to fill out. A lot of administrators were unable to process all of those ballots. It was a disaster. And it goes right back to this inability for the two branches to work together.
Right. You covered that so well, that Wisconsin debacle.
Thanks.
Do you think we've learned anything from it?
I do. Listen, the one thing I will say I'm very hopeful about for this election. I've been interviewing a ton of election administrators, secretaries of state and other administrators, and they are incredibly dedicated people. I mean, I cover politics in part, and I enjoy politics, and I'm not cynical about it because I do believe that most of these people really have good intentions, and you have to fundamentally believe that. But they are working very hard on making sure that this election works. Now, they are stymied by the same things that most other government agencies are stymied by: money and time. Right? This is a very short window to try to get all of this done. It's not going to sneak up on them like it did on Wisconsin, but there are mistakes that are going to be made. There are ballots that are going to get lost. There are counting errors that are going to happen. There are long lines and snafus with the machinery. It's going to happen. there's no doubt about it. But to the point that I think everybody has made here is to make sure that what we are reporting on is the actual the facts of the case, and to not immediately assign nefarious purpose.
I appreciate that. We should report the facts and not speculate as to nefarious purposes on either side. But Andrea, if Amy is right, that there will be, it will take time to know the results. There will be snafus along the way. There will be, you know, I stood in Tallahassee for weeks in 2000. So, you know, I'm having a PTSD flashback each time I think ahead to November 3rd, writ large. How do we avoid what Jerry is concerned about? A lack of faith in the process coming out of November 3rd as we head toward January 20th for our young voters and for all our voters.
I think we have to communicate and let people know what to expect, you know, so this is part of the work right now. We're doing that. We're saying, you know, this election may take a little bit longer to make sure every vote is counted. But the important part is that every vote is counted, not that you know by 9 o'clock on election night what the result is. And we know that there are some states that are scaling up their vote by mail systems, and that it may take a little bit longer to count. One of the things that can happen that we hope to see happen is, you know, report on the number of ballots that have yet to be counted in a state. You know, that sort of thing could greatly help to make sure that everybody is confident in our election systems. There are many election officials across the country who are working 24/7 right now to ensure our elections. So I think we have to keep letting people know the processes that are in place that they can have complete, you know, faith in. And then in post-election, you know, explaining to the American public exactly, you know, what the different, you know, what's happening day to day and the most clear way possible is going to be really important. I mean, we're administering an election in the middle of a pandemic. It's a unique moment, but there's a lot of educational work and, you know, conversation we can have to make sure that everybody feels really comfortable with the process that is, you know, that is in place. And I think that, you know, it's more challenging in an environment where people are intentionally trying to, you know, to play on people's fears. And so I think that, you know, our job is to just, you know, make sure that everything is grounded in fact and that people know they have trustworthy voices they can listen to. I think the other key with young people is to make sure that we're meeting people where they live for the information. One of the things that was in the Knight report said that younger generation really isn't proactively looking for the news in the same sort of way. So one of the things we've done at vote.org is we're trying to reach people through social media. We've, you know, have partnerships with WhatsApp. We have people, partnerships with all sorts of tech companies and influencers throughout the, you know, throughout the sphere to make sure that those messages can be delivered in whatever fashion that people in a younger age demographic are going to see it, whether it's through Taylor Swift and her posts or something on, you know, Snapchat or TikTok or Instagram. Like we're willing to go wherever that message needs to be heard and to be delivered. So I think there's something to remembering that we're talking about a lot of different segments of the population here. And so just making sure we're meeting anyone where they're at with the, you know, very, you know, straightforward ballot information that they need.
I want to come over to, I'm going to finish with the two journalists where I started off. Hopefully, if we started off with a cynical note, I'm going to ask you both for some note of hopefulness. So start thinking now. But let me go over to you, Sam, to pick up on what Andrea said, because I think we can tease out of the Knight Foundation report some cues. You used the word several times that voters think that the system is rigged. Those who don't vote think the system is rigged, and those who do vote still have faith on some level that the system can work for them. And so if we're going to encourage people to vote, we have to meet them, as Andrea said, where they are. There are cues in your reporting on how we meet them where they are and talk to them about the ways in which the system can possibly work for them. In other words, maybe it's not as rigged as you think it is. So can you say a little bit about what the study says about that?
Yeah, and maybe something that was illustrative in this regard in the follow-on study that we did just of college students. And so this is fresher data. This is in the middle of COVID. This was in the field in August. We actually asked people, which I think really speaks to this question, what would undermine your confidence in the fairness of the election, and gave them a list of things that could happen. It's not surprising for young people, if the winner of the popular vote loses on the electoral college, that would undermine their sense of fairness. Problems at polling places is something that would undermine their sense of fairness. Evidence of foreign interference would undermine their sense of fairness. Really interestingly, that it would take several weeks to determine the winner did not register highly as something that would necessarily cause people to think the election was unfair. A majority of votes being cast by mail is not something that would cause young people to think that the vote was unfair. So I think one question we might ask ourselves is, what do we have control over in this election cycle? I don't think we really have a lot of control over shoring up people's belief in institutions, as Amy noted at the outset, that has ebbed for decades. But we have a lot of control over the way that we talk about what's happening in the process in the lead up to Election Day, on Election Day, and beyond. And every single person has control. Obviously, elected officials, and this has been spotlighted in the presidential debate, have control over whether they're going to hold themselves to say this is a fair result and I'm going to accept what it is as a standard of conduct. I think the media has a ton of control, not only about calling the election, but also what is going to be the implied effect of showing all the long lines and saying this is just what some feared. So I think the media, national media in particular, local media, they need to ask themselves, what are our standards of reporting going to be on Election Day when some of these problems are going to precipitate? Obviously, we need to report if there are problems, but how are we going to report that? What's the feeling that we're going to leave viewers with? And these are not new problems for newsrooms. There are problems when protests are being covered about what the feel of the protest is to the person watching it, particularly if it's on TV. It's the hack and leak debate that's happening right now, I know, in every major newsroom in America. How are we going to cover potential hacks and leaks? I think you've got to have the same kind of red team focused on how are we going to cover the election. That's something we can control. And then I think the other thing that we can control, and this goes to Amy's point about election administrators, one thing that election administrators are imploring people to do is to say that you can vote, still register, is to say that you can vote and here's where you can vote, is to just make clear the steps you can take to make sure that your vote is counted. The other thing that election administrators are imploring people to do is to not go spread concerns on Election Day and after election. And of the many moves that social media companies in particular have taken, I think actually many of them I wonder about the efficacy, but one that I'm really hopeful about is that Facebook in particular says they will proactively work to remove from the platform content that seeks to report that the election has been decided before that's actually happened. And that's a place where I think a year ago they wouldn't have gone there. And now they're going to say that this content violates our standards. So I think that's something that the study suggests could really have salutary benefit in the weeks after Election Day.
Well, of course, now, Sam, at the end of our panel, you bring up Facebook. It's a whole nother panel for a whole nother day. But we certainly could talk about, we didn't talk about all the things the Mueller report revealed, but you did underscore, Sam, thank you, the things that do undermine our confidence in our democracy, and they're not counting the vote carefully over time. That's not one of those things. So I want to come back over to our two journalists where we started. We're all journalists of a sort. We all care about our democracy. We're covering the story in different ways. But to Amy and Jerry specifically, who are writing about this, reporting on this, I want to end where we began and ask you sort of a philosophical question, if you don't mind, and that is about restoring our faith. When we hear Sam talk about the 100 million people not voting because they don't have a faith in our system, essentially. That's it. They think it's rigged. They don't think it works for them. This is decades in the making. And Jerry, you said earlier, people can remember the fight for the right to vote, the Edmund Pettus Bridge and John Lewis nearly losing his life there. People of a certain age can remember that, but many do not, a couple generations now. So how do we restore that faith in our democracy such that that fundamental right to vote is exercised? Jerry, you first, and then Amy, I'll give you the last word.
Well, you know, Davey Martinez is the manager of the Washington Nationals, which is a team that Amy and I both love. And he said that after they won the World Series last year, bumpy roads lead to beautiful places, right? So that's what you have to believe. I do have a feeling that if you look at everything that's happened this year in the wake of a 2016 election that was decided by 33,000 votes across 3 states, people realized your vote does matter. And they remember that. And I have a feeling right now that in the environment that we're in now, in the post-George Floyd environment in particular, people do have a sense that they're going to pick up this democracy and put it on their backs and carry it forward. And it's not somebody else's job. Now, maybe I'm being optimistic in saying that. Maybe I'm being naive in saying that. But I kind of think that's one of the things that's happened this summer, is that people have decided by going out into the streets, among other ways, to show that they're going to take responsibility for this society. And one of the ways you do that is you vote. So I guess I would just close by saying that to me, that means maybe that's one of the after effects of a pretty ugly 6 months that we've been through.
Amy, before I turn to you, I want to flag that the National Association of Councils on Developmental Disabilities has written in to say that this is such an important conversation for people with disabilities, especially for people with intellectual developmental disabilities. Lack of faith, lack of information, and lack of ability to get to the polls, lack of accessible polls or accessible voting mechanisms, misinformation on social media. There are 62.5 million eligible voters that identify as having a disability, and only 16 million voted in 2016. Please make the entire process inclusive. So thank you very much for writing in with that note. We really appreciate it. And Amy, I'm gonna give you then, on the heels of that very poignant note from one of our audience members, the final word. I think I heard did I hear a glimmer of hopefulness from Gerald Seib? I think I did.
Yes, look, and I think we all have the glimmer of hopefulness. As I said, that watching these election officials and the people involved in the process of administering this election has, and again, I get to do this for a living, so I have access that not a lot of people have, but definitely restored my faith in the infrastructure that has been built, the system of 50 individual states and how they administer their elections. Look, there are still going to be challenges and problems. There's still going to be debates over everything from how to register, what you need to do to bring, what you need to bring to the polls. All of these things are going to be long-running debates. But I think ending with this, the realization that we're about to hit, I think, record level turnout, and that so much of it will come by mail or early, suggests that, we are now at a tipping point. And it goes to the note that you read right before you came to me, that this opens doors to folks who have felt like they didn't have an access or ability to have their vote and their voice heard. And there's really no going back now. We've seen some states, especially those in the West, have had vote by mail entirely. The process is entirely vote by mail for some time now. And other states have been slowly sort of creeping up to 60-70% of the vote coming in early by mail. Now, some of those states that had lagged behind, I think, are going to be joining these 21st century and are going to now have a process by which people who really want to be able to participate but can't, for whatever reason, have access to the polls on election day have more opportunities. And so I think at the end of the day, if it means that more people are able to get involved because they get a ballot delivered to their house and they know it's going to be coming every election, that seems to be hopeful to me.
And with that, we'll say a very warm thank you to Sam Gill from the Knight Foundation, Andrea Hailey, vote.org, and of course to Gerald Seib, Wall Street Journal, Amy Walter of the Cook Report. And Amy, we'll see you on Friday on The Takeaway. Good night, everybody.